The first speaker is Professor Miguel Centeno, who has written one of the most distinguished books on warfare and the nation-state, Blood and Debt, War and State-Making in Latin America, 2002, which gives a genuinely illuminating understanding of nation and state building, reversing the Eurocentric perspectives that we've had. And so it's a great pleasure to have him. The paper he's going to present is again, a joint effort with Maria Abascal, a graduate student in sociology at Princeton. And so he will talk on the geography of American nationalism.
Hello. If you don't mind, the only way I can read this is if I stand in here. So, sorry if I'm crowded. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I knew that I had finally made it as an academic when I got an invitation from the LSE. So thank you so much. You've made my mother very, very proud. The second thing is I want to give full recognition to Maria Abascal. While I'm going to be presenting the paper, Maria certainly deserves her position, not just by the alphabet, but because of her contribution to this paper as first author. Last thing is you will see that this is an exercise in sort of traditional American empirical bloody-mindedness. Right now, it's very exploratory. We're basically analyzing data. We're telling a data story. To what extent we can make some sort of general claims following this. Hopefully we'll get some hints from the questions, and hopefully later on there'll be a paper that speaks more generality about geographies of nationalism. With that, let's see if I can do this. All right, the motivations for this paper are, first of all, the exceptional level of nationalism that is exhibited in the United States. Almost any kind of measure that you see, public opinion data, etc., shows that the United States is extremely nationalist country, or patriotic country. We can get into issues of definition, etc. But almost universally, if not unanimously, people consider that the United States would be perhaps the most nationalist country in the OECD. At the same time, there's renewed attention to regionalization in the United States. Increasingly, we're seeing, Congressman, I'll reference a few people in a little bit, that the United States is coming apart as a unity, that there is more polarization, that there's greater differences between regions, that there's an increasing amount of rural-urban diversity. And so that's our second motivation. And the third one is that this regionalization and this extreme nationalism, I would say extreme nationalism, has electoral consequences to the United States. And when the United States gets a cold, the world gets pneumonia. What matters in the United States, the kinds of foreign policy decisions that the United States takes, have global repercussions. There we go. Now, the major part of the paper is motivated actually by the theme of this conference. When I was invited, as Maria and I were speaking, and we decided to address these issues that have been addressed all throughout the last few days, which is that a lot of research on nationalism still assumes borders and territories. We speak of these units. Nationalism studies is not unique to this. The political economy of development does this, for example. Speaking of Brazil as a unit or India as a unit, when that absolutely makes no sense at all for just about any kind of dependent variable that you can imagine. And the problem with this idea of speaking in these categories, and speaking of nations and states, is that obviously some nations have more than one state. So how do we distinguish? How do we talk about German nationalism, for example, if we're discussing German nationalism in the 19th or the 20th or the 21st century? Do we want to include the Austrian population? If we want to make it broader, do we want to perhaps include the Flemish population? So how do we do this? And moreover, there are countries that have more than one nation. So is it possible to speak of Spanish nationalism? Yesterday, I went to a couple of colleagues who were Catalan, and I said, somos hispanos. And their eyes went up and they went, no. You're Castellano, and I'm Catalan. And certainly, again, an extreme example would be the case of India, where speak of a single nation defined by the state boundaries of India would make no sense. Now, again, the United States appears very, very nationalist. This is from a wonderful dissertation by Art Wanikowski, a graduate student at Princeton, who is now a professor at Harvard. And he did a wonderful analysis of public opinion data, trying to identify forms of nationalism. And one of the ones he came up with is ultra-nationalist. These are people who feel very, very strongly about identifying with their nation and with their state. And the numbers for the United States were just way over the top. The United States had the highest degree of ultra-nationalists on all measures that Bart used. And again, you can reference his dissertation. The United States really is an incredible outlier. So there's a great deal of nationalism in the United States. But is it uniform? Is the United States the same amount of nationalism throughout? What is the distribution of nationalist sentiment in the United States, or patriotism in the United States? Is every region really American? And this becomes really silly, especially after the 2008 election, when the concept of the real America arose. Now, this is a very old theme in American political discourse, but it's become standardized. So can we talk about a real America? Is all America equally real? Or can we say that people are American in different ways? People are nationalist Americans in different ways. So regionalism in the United States has been a great deal of empirical work done first on different American nations. That is, there's the West, there's the Midwest, there's the South, there's the Northeast, there's New England, there's the cities, etc. There's been differences in the way, Maria has done some great work on immigrant reception and ethnicity, and how that is differentiated across the United States. It's a wonderful book called The Big Sort by Bishop that basically looks at how America is becoming extremely polarized, not just in terms of politics, but also in lifestyle issues, etc. And you can see this, any of you who travel to the United States, you can actually categorize neighborhoods, for example, by the car manufacturer. There are neighborhoods where you will largely see American cars. There are neighborhoods where you will only see Subarus. It's at that level. Or if you look at television viewing programming or media sources, etc., it's become extremely regionalized. And this has led to the polarization, not just polarization on ideological levels, but polarization accompanying regionalization. And here's a couple of examples just to show you. There's different languages, religions, and lifestyles. So this is for fun. Generic names for soft drinks. And there's actually very clear regional effects. In the South, it's just called Coke. So you say, I'll have a Sprite Coke. There is soda pop, or pop, and there is soda. All right? You can see this in terms of religion. This is a Baptist belt. All right? This is a Lutheran belt. This is largely a Methodist. All right, so the country has these clear differences, and Patchwork Nation has actually done this and run a whole series of cluster analysis where they talk about different kinds of communities, and they're mapped out there. We wanted to do this for nationalism. Now, a unit of analysis is not individual, it's the county. We have data on a whole variety of variables, we'll see in a second. On 3,100 counties, that is the basic administrative unit below the province level in the United States. And we argue, first of all, we do that because that's what we have the data. But we also argue that it's meaningful to do that because sentiments like nationalism really cannot be understood on a purely individual level. They have to be understood in a geographical context. They have to be understood in a social context. Nationalism is not an individual characteristic, it is a social fact and should be studied as such. Our variables are ideology, very, very broadly understood. We also look at ethnicity. And then where I think we're doing something new, I hope, is we're looking at three forms of behavior. Voting, taxing, and serving in the military. And we want to argue that these three behavioral measures of nationalist sentiment, of patriotic sentiment, those are the three good indicators of a sense of a duty to the state. And we want to talk about to what extent these are distributed equally across the United States. So let's first talk about political ideology. If you go to the web and you put in map for political ideology in the United States, you get lots of different representations depending on people's ideological proclivities. Yes, everyone just read this one. This one here is is the Consolidated States of America, and this is the fascist. Over here we have Texas and Czechoslovakia. California stands, and this one, of course, stands by itself. This was after this was after the 2004 election. Let's try to get a little bit less crude. And you're probably, again, if you've ever watched American media, you're very familiar with the blue, red, or the red, blue, purple maps. What we've done here is just coded by colors. The more red, the more, sorry. Oh, no. Well, yeah, you did it. I can't go backwards on this thing. The redder is the more Republican, the blue is the more Democrat. And you see a pattern. I mean, talk about, one of my favorite things would be, talk about a false correlation. You could actually talk about being near water, whether it's either the Mississippi, the lakes, or the oceans, leads one to liberality. But being in a dry place gets you closer to God. Now, this pattern was changed a little bit in 2008, but still reflects the same thing. You have essentially this blue rim of the country with the center of the country being very Republican. That's one way of looking at it. A much more interesting way we thought was to just look at the 2008 election. And what we did is, these are the counties where McCain got a larger representation of the vote than Bush. All right? So the rest of the country, Obama, except for Arizona, and this part right here, Obama gets a larger percentage of the vote, obviously, than Kerry, and also a larger percentage of the vote than Gore. Here, in this region, what we might call Palin country, there is a very clear sort of McCain, you will, whether this is a McCain effect, is this an Obama effect. I think this deserves a great deal of study. Just methodological clarity, from this map on, what we did in order to highlight variations, which is not legitimate perhaps in a paper, but certainly for a presentation's sake it's worthwhile, we've done the coloring by deciles. That means that the scales that you will be seeing are not going to be the same ones. They've been standardized by just doing it by deciles, and you'll see the implications of this in a little bit. So, so ideology, there seems to be that particular belt, that very, very Republican belt, if you will. We then wanted to look at ethnicity. So the traditional categories in the United States, black, white, and then Hispanic as another category. And what this is the number of blacks or African Americans in the 2008, I think. Not for the 2010 census, that date, I believe this is 2008. This is why I made the point, by the way, about the scales not being equal. So the median here is 2.13%. You shouldn't think of this part of the country as being predominantly black. But what's interesting here is the concentration of population. So if we're talking about an ethnic identity, you get very different United States. I did it again. Okay, sorry. You get the southern belt for a much larger black population. When you look at Hispanics, you see that it's the southwestern belt. Again, the median here is 2.8. But still, you get a sense of the concentration of where Hispanics might be. And if you go to whites, you see that whites are overrepresented, if you will, in this part of the country. So in some ways, the United States, if you wanted to make a pure ethnic argument about a national identity, actually the United States is facing this great difficulty that there are these different pockets of an ethnicity, of an identity. Now, we first wanted to look to see, and this actually breaks down even more. We then looked at, for non-blacks, non-Hispanics, there is a question of the census about ancestry. What is your family ancestry? And this is perhaps the most interesting result. Again, this is for the white population. And this is, by the way, the United States is a German nation. Okay? There's pockets of things here. This is French. And this is America. What is your family heritage? America. Which we think is actually pretty interesting. Especially when you start looking that this very zone is also that zone that voted more for McCain than did for Bush. If you start, is this just a false correlation, or is there a pattern to that? And we try to explore this. So are Republicans different? That is, are the counties that voted more for McCain than they did for Bush, do they have a structural, is there something that defines it? And what we have found is that there's a clear southern effect. Not south, the numbers, the percentage gains are negative, that is, the Democrats actually increase their votes. In the south, and particularly in the rural south, the Republicans gain. So there's clearly a regional effect going on here. And if you look at this, you'll see we have other nationalist measures, but what you'll find is that one of the most significant correlations is between Republican gains and considering yourself American, or between South suburban, and South rural. So urban South will not tend to have voted more Republican in 2004. The suburbs and the rural parts of the South have. What about Americans? Are people who say that their heritage is American? All right, again, we see the southern effect, and again, we see that it's a largely rural effect. So something is going on. There is a if you want to go that far, there is a sub-national identity that is rooted in an ideology, perhaps, and in a perception of heritage, which is concentrated in the American South. There's another way of illustrating it. Simply, there's a very clear relationship between the percentage of people who identify themselves as American in a county and the likelihood that the Republicans had gains in 2008 as opposed to 2004. So, are Americans different? Are people who classify themselves as American different? There is a pretty good correlation between American identity and American regionalism and is kind of ideological. So we said, okay, fine. Here's a Southern story. This is a legacy of the Nixonian 1968 Southern strategy. This is a story that's been talked about for the last 30, 40 years. We wanted to go beyond that, and we wanted to talk about nationalism as unity. Everyone has to quote Hegel and Marshall. So man, that's the original, has rights so far as he has duties, and duties as far as he has rights. If we look at Marshall, citizenship is a status bestowed on those who are full member of a community. All who possess the status are people with respect to rights and duties. So we want to take nationalism, we want to measure it as the extent to which people are fulfilling a set of duties towards the nation state. And we are using military service, voting, and taxation. So first of all, voting. This is turnout. If we think of nationalism as you're doing your duty as a citizen, are you willing to show up to vote? And what we find is an extreme regional effect. The darker, the more likely. You have, public radio, we love this. You have the circle, and since around Minneapolis, of absolute nationalism. These are the people who vote very, very regularly. So there's a strong Midwest effect in New England. This is the South, where voting participation is actually much, much lower. This is in 2000, just so you see that it's not a single effect. This is in 2004, and this is 2008. Again, a very high level of citizenship measured by voting, showing up to actually vote. I suspect, we haven't done it yet, I suspect if you did this for congressional elections as opposed to a presidential election, the effect would be even larger. Because there's a much lower turnout for congressional elections in the United States than there are for national elections. So we find in voting, if you talk about American nationalism expressed by your willingness to go to the poll and vote, there's a strong Midwest and New England effect, and it seems to be much weaker in the South. At least by this measure, the South would seem less patriotic, less nationalistic, following the Hegelian or Marxian notions. What about who pays? Okay, taxes are the price we pay for civilization. This is the most common duty that most people will have towards the state, is paying for the state. So we did this in a couple of ways, and we wanted to do it net. So first we looked at where does the government spend its money. These are total federal government expenditures, including Social Security payments, distributed across the country. And it appears that the effete coasts are getting much more money than the rest of the country. But if we do it per capita, you realize that that's largely a reflection of the population. That the part of the country that benefits the most from federal largesse is actually the Great Plains. And this is because of agribusiness and agricultural subsidies. Suspect you would not find a dissimilar pattern if you did the same thing in France, for example. Then we want to see, well, who's actually paying? Now, the American system is absurdly regressive, but it has some progressive capacities. So what you will see is that the richest parts of the country actually pay a larger percentage of their gross income. So the money to pay for the federal government is actually coming from Sodom and Gomorrah, with a contribution from Texas. That most of the country is actually paying a much lower level. And these are including Social Security tax, which are extremely regressive and which are, so they're not tied to income. So even if you include those, basically the country is living off a particular kind of reason. Now, what happens if you look at net federal dollars? Well, you find out that this part of the country and this part of the country is actually paying out net a huge amount of money. They are not getting as much money from the federal government as they're giving in. The parts, again, that really benefit are these parts of the Midwest. And then we did it, of course, per capita. And I have to, unfortunately, in the coding, the color all of a sudden becomes reversed on this. Sorry about that. It's because of the way we were measuring. So the dark spots are actually spots that receive less. The white spots are the ones who receive more. Okay, I'm sorry about that. It just makes it a little bit hard. But you can see that the Great Midwest, parts of the New York metropolitan area, and San Francisco and Los Angeles pay per capita a disproportionate amount for the maintenance of the state. At least in this way, they are more nationalist than is large parts of the South. So, expenditure and taxation are very regionalized. Urban centers tend to pay much, much more. There is a net flow to rural areas. Again, I suspect it's the same pattern if you look at Europe. Rural and Great Plains receive a lot more money. And in general, the Midwest seems, I'm sorry, this is because we didn't realize we had to reverse it. The Midwest receives least net from the U.S. government. The South tends to receive the most. All right, what about who serves? This is the third measure, let's say, of patriotism. You are willing to go put on a uniform, pick up a gun, and go fight. And what we see is, well, there's not much of a pattern. There is this great myth in the United States that only certain parts of the country, be the South, tend to serve in the military. That's not at all the case. This is one measure of this is veterans per 1,000. It's obviously thrown off because of retirement concentrations, so you get a much larger percent in Florida. Nevertheless, we think, assuming that people, it's going to be randomly distributed about where they want to spend their retirement years, this gives us an indication that there's really no zone of the country that is more patriotic in this way. What we find is actually, if you look at these, and you look at the distribution of this, there's a very strong rural effect. Rural America tends to send many more folks into the military than urban centers. We did another measure, which is military compensation per capita. So we have data on people's hometowns, and we also have data on per county how much they receive in military compensation. This gives us a very rough idea of who is serving from where. And here we do see a little bit of the Southern effect, but again, we see this sort of Great Plains effect. And this is largely driven, you'll see when we control for everything, this is largely driven because of the rural effect. We would argue that this is much less a regional effect than one that this is almost a perfect definition of rural America. And what we did, we tried to control military compensation per capita among male high school graduates. You basically need a high school diploma now to serve in the military. Recruitment standards, so we wanted to standardize this, and you basically get the same kind of pattern. We also did it with Afghanistan casualties. We're in the process of coding the Iraq. Fortunately, the data for Afghanistan is a much smaller number. It was too small to even do per capita. What we see here again is, with a relatively small number, once we get the Iraq data, we'll have a better sense. There is no clear regional concentration. And in fact, and again, this is not per capita, this is not controlling for population. What you find is that you would expect that the centers of population are the ones who, if death on the battlefield is randomly distributed by your region, they're the ones, they are serving as much as one would expect. This is Dallas and Houston, this is Los Angeles, this is the New York area, etc. We're hoping to improve this. We're waiting for better data from the U.S. Accession Command that will give us volunteer data, recruitment data by county. What we do have is some possible indication of Southern overrepresentation, but other data really indicates a rural effect. But cities are still providing a large light tax, if you will. Okay, let's start putting these all together. First thing is, at least by our three measures, there is no single sort of cross-correlating American nationalism. Some counties pay, some counties serve, some counties vote. The only one where we see some correlation is between turnout and veterans. And this might actually be less a function of a real causal mechanism than the elder tend to vote much more than the younger. There's much more likelihood you're a veteran if you're older, therefore you get that. We're going to explore that to a certain extent. If we put these all together and try to control for everything, so what can we find about the percentage who say they're Americans? We actually don't find any kind of relationship, positive relationship, with our other measures. In fact, there's a negative one for veterans and for turnout. What we find, not surprisingly, is that those maps don't lie. That the percentage who claim to be Americans by heritage is largely a Southern effect. And it's also a Southern rural effect. So the South does have more Americans in that way, in terms of the heritage or self-proclaimed heritage, if you will. If you look at veterans, the only relationship that we found that was positive is between veterans and the population 65 and over. That just makes structural sense, basic demographic sense. What we do find is there's actually, and there is also a Southern effect. This is largely driven by Florida. We had to define the South in a standardized way, so we used the Confederate States, and that includes Florida. So a large part of this, if we were to eliminate Florida from this, and in fact, when you eliminate, when you control for rural, Florida being the most urban of the Southern states, this turns actually negative. And finally, for turnout, the only really significant relationship we find, again, a rural effect. Okay, the countryside, if you will, tends to vote more. Okay, the countryside, in fact, the countryside tends to be more likely to send veterans and more likely to vote. And the federal receipts cannot be predicted by any of this. As you see, that R squared is index. Okay. Oh gosh, I have to talk. Oh, I didn't bring up the R squared is so low, you can't really predict where the money is being spent by any one of these particular variables. So, we wanted to start creating sort of varieties of American nationalism. There isn't a single sort of behavioral norm, and we can say, this is what nationalists are. So what we did is, we classified counties by super patriots. Those are 75th percentile of all the counties. These are the top 25 counties for all three of the variables. Okay? These are the hardcore folks. Patriots is 75th percentile or above in at least two of those duties. Band of Brothers, we try to make this a little bit obvious. Band of Brothers is the highest percentile of veteran shares. Model citizens are those who are in the 75th percent, counties that are in the 75th percentile or above in terms of voter turnout. Paymasters are those counties that are in the 75th percentile or above of payments to the federal government. And then free riders are all the counties. These are counties that do not qualify in the 75th percentile or above in any of our measures. And what we find is actually the United States is not very patriotic. Whether we measure it by number of counties or we measure it by population, the plurality of the American population does not seem to engage in any one of these behaviors. There are some super patriots. There are some patriots, Band of Brothers, model citizens, paymasters. But another map we all want to see is how are these distributed nationally? It's hard to sort of get an idea, but just to walk you through it. So the brown areas are the super patriots. And these are pretty randomly distributed across the country. There is no zone that consistently outdoes the other counties in delivery of these services. Patriots are the sort of light brown, and again, you get a little bit of a Western effect. Again, you get the Minneapolis-St. Paul. You never thought of Minneapolis-St. Paul as the center of American nationalism, but it ends up that it actually is. It's listening to Prairie Home Companion all the time. You have the paymasters. And of course, what this is concentrated in the cities. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Dallas, Houston, Miami, Atlanta, New York, etc. The cities, in a sense, are paying for the rest of the country. Band of Brothers, again, no regional pattern. Perhaps some in the South, but not very much. What you do get is that rural concentration. And of course, my favorite, free riders. And that tends to be very concentrated in the South. These southern counties are not voting above the standard. They are not paying taxes above the standard, nor are they volunteering above the standard. So our conclusions is there's evidence of very different nationalist types. If we again take nationalism as a behavioral, we take behavioral manifestations of nationalism. Your willingness to pay taxes, your willingness to serve in the military, your willingness to vote. There are very different types. There are some regional patterns. Again, there's a very strong rural effect that is worth analyzing. But there's certainly not the kind of stereotypes, and certainly not the kind of stereotypes that have been used by what can only be described as the radical right in the United States, otherwise known as the Republican Party. We're going to do further work. We hope to get data on consumption, for example. We're looking for measures such as flat sales of U.S. flags from Walmart. That's sort of a national sample. And to get a sense of how many people are engaging in a certain symbolic behavior. We have data on media patterns. So we'll be able to see, is there any relationship between a particular kind of nationalism as we're describing it and media. And of course we have attitudinal data, which will allow us to get into more standard measures of nationalism, love your country, etc., etc., etc. But we have relatively little faith in that, given the amount of nationalist and patriotic discourse in the United States. It pervades, it's in the air. That's why we're going so much on behavior. So our conclusions, that there's really no evidence of a national notion of nationalism. We don't see this consistent behavior across the United States. There is some regionalization. Certainly there's a rural-urban split. But the strongest part, the part that I'm most pessimistic about, is the strong Southern effect. Whether we want to talk about it in terms of political ideology, whether we want to talk about it in terms of self-identification of your heritage, whether you want to talk about taxation, etc. And we suspect, if you looked at lots of attitudinal measures, there's going to be still very, very strong Southern effect. Which leads us to the very pessimistic conclusion that 150 years later, the United States is still fighting the Civil War. That there is still this Mason-Dixon line that tends to define what nationalism is perceived as and what nationalism behaviors are associated with. And with that, thank you very much.